Hello, this is going to be a brief philosophical lecture today. Um, I haven't made a few lectures in probably a week or so. Just coping with depression, my social isolation, and such. Um, so this lecture today is going to be about the topic is this kind of perennial metaphysical and ontological topic, and the topic is why do abstract objects exist rather than they don't exist? In terms of not just merely, mono universal kind of notion where only one universe exists, but rather a transworld identity across numerous and perhaps even infinite or even transfinite or even absolutely infinite number of worlds. So first of all, let's define what an abstract object is. Now, is an abstract object a mereological aggregate? Now, mereology is the philosophical study, by the way, of part to whole relations between intervals of conjunctivist topological closed boundaries that can be objectively measured and quantified in any 2D or 3D or even 4D dimensional geometry, topology, homology, etc. So, in terms of whether abstract objects are merely mereological aggregates of kind of pluralities or of possibilism, whether it's ontological possibilism or empirical possibilism, metaphysical possibilism, there isn't always a strict divide and concrete line, right, between empirical epistemology, metaphysical, and even theogonical. The ontology of the birth of theology, which is on theogony. So uh, the question now becomes, well, why do objects exist rather than they don't exist? And my argument basically is that abstract objects exist because combinatorial law that forces the atomic and subatomic mereological infusions that allow the mixing and matching of combinatorial properties is a fundamental a priori analytic, pre-deductive, and pre-Kantian law that might even be predeterministic. In other words, every object in our universe, whether it's purely concrete or it's purely abstract. Now, some philosophers even argue that the abstract and concrete distinction doesn't even exist. Like, what is physicalism? Is it just merely the sensations of your Merleau-Ponty-esque embodiment? If atoms don't exist, then what is a physical object? So it's not always easy in terms of strict Boolean quantification to draw a boundary, whether it's mathematical or purely philosophical. So abstract objects seem to kind of signify then kind of a universalization of the necessity of mathematical combinatorics across every possible world as a rigid designator. Now, what is a multiverse or omniverse without combinatorics? Well, in essence, kind of like a absolute matterless, formless universe where there's no kind of individuating hexides or quiddities. It's kind of like one big contiguous pseudomorpheus lump or aggregate of disjunctivist pieces or pieces. And what I mean is that monads tied up, sliced up, and not even in a tangibly coherentist modality or way. So it does seem that in order to have structure in terms of individuation, whether it's the quiddities, the hexides, the properties that one perceives evidently. So I think that philosophically speaking, this is going to be again a brief lecture. It's not like an overarching argument or anything, but it's just basically an admission that abstract objects very well exist not purely because of qualia or sense datum, but because in order for a chair or a table or a Christmas tree or a couch, for example, to have any sort of hexity or quiddity or qualia that we actively persistently perceive, do this empiricization of the sameness of properties, it kind of becomes in a meta-ontological law that can defy cradalism or relativism of perception. Unless really one is a synesthesiac, but how many people are synesthesiac statistically if one uses a... But then again, one could say, well, quantification isn't everything. So it's kind of the good old synesthesiac inverted qualia argument. Yeah. Now, I whispered to Han, sorry, by Han I mean the lovely companion in the cosmogonic sea of all possible and Eric fronting voices. Now, I want to say that abstract objects, and in the future, I hope that there is a quantum computing method of quantifying all the possible properties and individuation assemblages that compose the epiphenomenal construct, which is known as every possible monadic abstract object across the omniverse. And I hope that I leave this lecture imparted to you, excuse me, that philosophy itself is, many people say, well, abstract objects are absolutely perennial to the existence of philosophy. You basically can't do philosophy without abstract objects, much like you can't do, high level architectural artistry without structuralist building in mind. But I think the more complex question is when an object truly becomes abstract versus when it's merely kind of a semantic designation of a quantification of its mathematical volume, but that in itself doesn't reveal the intentionality or intentionalism or the epiphenomenalism or emanationism of the abstractionality itself. So I think that whether abstract objects truly exist, I mean, there's probably some neo-Pythagoreans out there who contest, everything is changeless, everything is basically one underlying substance, the very absolute infinite regressive level of ontological levels. And I mean, I'm supposed it's a quantum indeterminate argument, though some possible exotic worlds may or more or less allow for neo-Pythagoreanism, topic for another day. But I will close this by saying briefly, this lecture, by saying that the notion of what it means for an abstract object to not just individuate itself, but transworld persist and conceive its own panpsychism and sapience and even cosmopsychism in intergalactic or interstellar context is absolutely amazing. It's like, how does an abstract object require its own constitution of the basic nanoscopical level of consciousness, and how is an abstract object fundamentally different from strictly a mathematical or even a platonic geometrical object? Are all geometrical objects just mere subsets of abstract objects, or are abstract objects more so subsets of a higher kind of pan-Pythagorean mathematical omnipresent or a narrow present in the omnipresence of dreams, modal realistically reality? Thank you so much. And I'll leave you with this one question, which you can chew on, I suppose, or just something to think about, which is, if abstract objects never existed, or if their existence is self-contest to existence, according to nominalists, for example, then why so much of quantum theory and even Newtonianism, and much of what we take as the kind of mere topological building blocks of our natural physicalized omniverse, why is it then that we seem to see consistent kind of hexides or quintities? We see the sky always seems consistently blue if you're not synesthesiac, or it seems the grass seems consistently green. Now, we don't know, a person on the street might see red but as green, or blue as the sun, but that kind of challenges much of the orthodoxy, I suppose, or heterodoxy about the commonality of perception. And so either you go against extreme individuationism or you argue for the commonality. And more people, it seems statistically, at least in a pure statistical sense and reference, seem to swing before communalism of perception. So an abstract object, whether it's merely an individualistic existence or anonymously, humanity kind of agrees communalistically that we need, hexides and quintities, and whether hexides and quintities, say, of chairness or a tree, or I don't know, dendromancer, worshiper of the trees, whether those possess eternal, persistent hexides or quintities, which are self-tautological properties that make it essentially unique in its assemblage of ontological predicates, tropes, atoms, whatever, then the question then becomes, then if hexine and quiddity aren't abstract, then why do they seem to then supervenience upon our perception at all? That's not in itself a graphier relation, which is mathematical, and a mathematical is entirely Platonic, which, I mean, it doesn't have to be by any modal necessity, but it often is demoralized, I suppose, as such. Then if then I would argue that notion of mathematical essentialism towards hexity and quiddity, and therefore abstract objects existence, at least in that sense, seems impertinent. So thank you so much, and I hope you take away this, and you maybe one day there'll be even a stock engine or a Quackle, the Scrabble-like engine that kind of determines the abstract level of abstraction per each ontological aggregate or metaphysical aggregate across our entire omniverse, or metaverse. So Anyways, thank you so much, and Amor Fati, and be well.